Today, we'll be speaking with Dr. Jim Coan on the social regulation of emotion. Jim Coan is an associate professor of clinical psychology and the director of the Virginia Affective Neuroscience Laboratory at the University of Virginia. His recent work emphasizes the neural systems supporting socially mediated forms of emotion regulation. Dr. Coan received the inaugural Janet Taylor Spence Award for Transformative Early Career Contributions from the Association for Psychological Science, as well as the Early Career Award from the Society for Psychophysiological Research. So I now turn to our Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. Jim Coan. So welcome, Jim. Thanks for speaking with us today.
Thanks for having me on.
So I know all of us are very curious to hear a bit about sort of what was your path, kind of what first got you started in the study of emotion? What piqued your interest?
I guess it all started about 20 years ago, a little more than 20 years ago, when I went to work as an undergraduate research assistant in the lab of John Gottman at the University of Washington when I was there in Seattle. Mm-hmm. And I learned the facial action coding system, and I learned the SPAF and started co-developing the SPAF with John, and which I may discuss later. But it really came down to spending several years really scrutinizing people's emotional behavior when they fought with each other, which is, pretty fertile ground for studying emotions.
Excellent. So you got into studying fights, Yeah,
right.
Took you ever since.
Causing them. That was the other critical thing. It was really fun to bring couples in and goading them into fighting with each other.
Causing a few divorces along the way, all in the name of emotion research. Cool. So what I'd love to ask you now is just a few questions about your research. So, all of us can relate to trying to manage or regulate emotions in our own lives, but defining what emotion regulation is a really thorny, tricky issue. So I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on what is emotion regulation exactly, kind of how is it different from emotion, and as someone who studies the social regulation of emotion, sort of where does the social piece fit into all of this?
Yeah. It is really tricky, and it's tricky at every level of differentiation. There's emotions, which is sort of affective evaluations of contexts that can cause coordinated outputs of responses that we like to cluster into constructs that we call emotions, fear, sadness, whatever. There's those kinds of things that just sort of happen to us. And then there's our attempt to sort of modulate those things or moderate them, to either make them more intense in the case of doing something really fun, or to avoid them in the case of, trying to anticipate a potential fear response that we don't want to have, so we'll do something else. Or suppress our responses to them, if we're talking to our boss and they're really making us upset and we don't want them to know, so we clench it down. All of those other things are sort of, there's sort of the activation, as James Gross likes to call it, and then the regulation that sort of precedes or follows. And because it can precede or follow, it gets really complicated and it's hard to define. The social piece I became really interested in by watching these couples in the Gottman lab 20 years ago, who would be in the context, in the midst of a real, like a conflict. They'd be fighting with each other. And then one of them would say, but I love you. It's really not, don't worry. We're going to work through this. Or, this reminds me of this other time that was really fun. I know it's kind of funny because we're having a fight right now, but, it just makes me think, or they'd apologize. And the thing that you'd see when they would do that is that the person on the receiving end of those sort of loving messages would, within a second sometimes, show a decrease in their autonomic levels of arousal in the fight. And I really sort of clung to that when I saw that. That seemed fascinating to me because it seemed like I was really observing a system. And so when you start talking about social emotion regulation, you start really expanding beyond, in some ways it's obvious, but you expand beyond the single person's head, what's going on between their ears. And the emotional system starts becoming dyadic or group level or other kinds of things. It's a whole different beast. And we're seeing that in some of our data, I think.
Well, it's really cool because you are taking it to a whole other level and ballpark when you start bringing other people in the lab, right? And I think what's really cool that you've done here is develop this concept of social baseline theory as a way to sort of understand how we utilize or harness our social environment to help us be more effective regulators of our own feelings. And I'd just love to hear a little bit more about sort of what do you see as the most kind of exciting part or discoveries within that theory?
Well, the crazy discovery for me, the thing that just knocked me out was that initially, part of the reason we called it social baseline theory later on is that we were doing these studies of emotional responses in the scanner, and we had what we considered the baseline condition, which is someone alone in the scanner, and they have these threat responses when we threaten them with electric shock, and then we have them hold hands with people. I know we threaten. It's horrible.
Sounds like an interesting experiment.
Yeah, you ought to try it. But when they were holding someone's hand, they were less threat responsive. So far, everybody, that's not scandalous to anybody. That just makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. Your grandma could have told you that. But the startling finding was that the mechanism of regulation in the brain that we expected to find, we didn't find at all. So what we expected was that the hand-holding was going to decrease threat responsive activity in places like hypothalamus and insula and ACC. It's a little technical, sorry, but that we were going to see increases with handholding in regions of the prefrontal cortex, like perhaps the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex or the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and that these increased prefrontal activations were going to themselves be exerting that regulatory influence on these other affective responses. We didn't see that at all. There was no evidence for that at all. It just depressed me. I was shocked. All of these regions of the prefrontal cortex that we thought were going to be more active and mediating the handholding effect were themselves just less active. So nothing was happening in the prefrontal cortex. And so then we tried to find any kind of mediator in the brain. We couldn't find anything. And it was like magic. And that was really upsetting because, we like to have our little mechanisms.
That's right.
And someone suggested to me, someone here when I got here at the University of Virginia, Denny Profit, suggested to me that maybe I was viewing the baseline condition incorrectly. That maybe the handholding condition was more like the brain's natural baseline state. And that when people were alone, that was just weird. That was weird in terms of the way that the human brains are built and designed to interact with the world. And so we really started investigating this from the perspective of a discipline called behavioral ecology that's oriented towards studying how organisms adapt themselves to a specific environment. And we started asking ourselves, well, what is the environment that humans are adapted to? And we couldn't find anything. Humans are absolutely everywhere. We're all over the world. We've walked on the moon. We've been, so the only real constant in human environmental context seems to be other humans. And it started sort of really coming together at that point. This little finding, this strange, initially upsetting finding, that the prefrontal cortex was not mediating the regulatory effect of handholding, just snowballed into this whole new understanding for me of how to think about the design of the human brain and what the ecology of the human animal is.
It's amazing just how the most unexpected and sometimes disappointing results at the beginning are the ones that completely change how you think about things, from that point forward, right?
Right.
So if you had to summarize then, would you say that the brain does support this distinction between these social forms of emotion regulation that seem to be our natural baseline environment and these other kinds of emotion regulation, what we do in most of our studies, having someone alone in the scanner, viewing different kinds of images or words?
Yeah, they're hugely different. They're mediated completely differently, I think. So I think there's really clear, amazing evidence from lots of people that self-regulation, telling yourself it's only a movie, something like that, this is prefrontally mediated. If you're going to inhibit emotional responses, direct attention, hold concepts in working memory, all of these things that all of this executive function that the prefrontal cortex mediates, all of this is necessary for self-regulation. None of it seems necessary for social regulation. None of it. So you could have no cortex and probably benefit from hand-holding. because hand-holding is an unconditioned kind of, well, not hand-holding, but touch, physical proximity is kind of an unconditioned kind of response. And it does get tricky on some borderland tasks. So, Naomi Eisenberger and Art Aaron's group, Bianca Acevedo and other people, they have these studies where they show people pictures of their loved ones in the scanner. And you see some of the downregulation effect in places like the DACC. And that does seem to be mediated by the prefrontal cortex. So is that social regulation or self-regulation? I've started to really think that that's really a sort of those are self-regulation aids. Those are ways to implement a self-regulation kind of strategy. And I've used them myself. I look at pictures of my beautiful daughter when I'm feeling blue or whatever, and it makes me feel great again. And that's gonna be prefrontal mediated. So I think the mechanism is the thing that the really key distinction for the different types of regulation.
So then what do you think are the kind of next steps or sort of discoveries on the horizon? Are we going to have groups of people in the scanner, like hand-holding circles, or, what do we do next?
Well, I think
Yeah.
One of the big questions that's really left open is what is, in fact, the mechanism? We still don't know. We've done a bunch of these hand-holding studies now with a bunch of different kinds of samples, and all we ever find is that we can't find the mechanism. So, what is it? And we're starting to think, we really think that it's going to be really, really, really bottom-up kind of perception, that a lot of these things about who it is you're standing next to, what your relationship history is with those people, there's some kind of fast pathway through perceptual systems. And so we're now going to be doing these studies with EEG to try and to map these things in terms of milliseconds instead of seconds in the scanner. And that might I think that'll get us closer. So that's one thing for the future, is really what are the mechanisms? The other thing is, I think one of the things we're finding out is when we, in a sense, outsource our vigilance processing, for example, to a close friend, you start getting into like cybernetic kind of distributed processing kinds of questions that get very complicated for me very quickly, very mathematical. And so I think working with people who can compute those kinds of complexities is going to be something I want to do. We're really thinking that the self, the whole idea of what the self is, starts becoming distributed across social networks, and that's part of the function of those networks. So the other direction for the future is, this is much bigger than emotion regulation. You see these effects now in everything, I think, from Dacker's great study of basketball players and touch to collective IQ and the way that groups solve problems together. The best predictor of collective IQ in a study published in Science a couple of years ago was not the average IQ of the group, or if groups had very high IQ, a member who had very high IQ, the rest of them tend to loaf, and so the whole collective IQ tended to decrease. Mm-hmm. The best predictor was how sensitive people were to information around the eyes, affective information in the mind and the eyes task. That's fascinating to me. When we're
so cool, yeah,
tied in together socially, we're geniuses. So,
social geniuses, right? So the last question I want to ask you, you do so many exciting things. It's like I could go on forever. But one of the things that I think is especially cool is that you've, pioneered and developed this manual, SPAF, for coding these dynamic and fluid exchanges of emotional expressions. It's something I know I use in my lab, and many other people use it, and we teach about it in classes on human emotion. I guess a lot of people would love to know kind of what got you interested in developing this coding manual in the first place.
Well, I first have to make real clear that the SPAF was initially developed entirely by John Gottman. And he got really interested in the SPAF because when he was sort of growing up in the 70s and 80s as a young professor, all of the excitement was around things like the facial action coding system, the FACS, and these really microanalytic kinds of things. And those made a tremendous, amazing contribution. We're all indebted to those kinds of things. But they were not very efficient. It's hard to code those things and to extract all the information. John just really wanted to code at the construct level, and he wondered if you could avoid coding specific movements about the face and diagramming all the numbers and code sadness, code dominance, code defensiveness and contempt just directly at the construct level, because that's what we're really interested in. So he started drawing from all of these other microanalytic systems, stuff work by Klaus Scherer on voice tone and pitch and modulation, the facts with Paul Ekman, and just paying attention to what people actually said, because that's relevant, and sort of wondered if he could train people to integrate all of those things and code at a sort of gestalt level while things were happening. He sort of did it. I mean, the initial attempts were a little rocky. The starts were a little rocky. When I started working with him in 1991, what?
In Seattle in the early 90s.
We started really seeing how far we could take this, and so we would have people the couple would come in, they'd have their fight, and while it was happening, the coders would be coding, second by second. And it would be done by the time the couple left. So it was very, very rapid and pretty predictive of things. So since then, we've really been working on refining this and really understanding what the constructs are, how best to describe them to people, how best to utilize not only what we call a physical features approach, which is sort of the facial action coding system, facts kind of thing, what are the numbers, but also utilize people's social history. The fact that you are a person who grew up around other people makes you a really good coder at a certain level right at the outset. So we're never going to be able to give a computer a social history. And so we think that matters for coding, and I think we've got some good evidence for that.
So what kind of context do you think SPAF is most useful in? I know fighting, your favorite context. What others? Or is that the best one?
Well, that's probably the best one. That's what it was designed for. But, we now have trained people to use and code SPAF for group therapy sessions, therapy client interactions, interactions between bosses and employees. I consulted briefly for a blink of an eye for NASA way back in the late 90s. When they were doing some stuff with the International Space Station. I give workshops now to people in business and government. A lot of people come to the SPAF, and I think for the facts as well, to catch people in a lie, and it really just irritates me because I don't think that's a very good use of it, and partly because it's not going to work. I think it does is give people a real explicit language for talking about emotional behaviors and feelings and intentions. And I think that just having a more detailed way to describe those things can often help sort of unknot knotty social problems and lay them on the table. So it's broadly applicable in that way.
So I have to ask then, and I did warn you ahead of time, what is your favorite expression in the SPAF coding system, and can you make it?
Oh yeah, I can make them all, but the hard part is what's my favorite. So I have a favorites. So bear with me. One of my favorites is what we call the horns, and I did it just now. Oh. It's when the outer portion of the brows go up. In fact, it's a 2. People when they're being sort of dominant in a conversation, when they're lecturing, or in the context of couples fighting, when they're patronizing or something, they'll frequently go like this, and they'll often tilt their head down. And that's why we started calling them the horns. It's kind of funny the way it looks. So that's one of my favorites. One of the other ones is the unfelt smile. So you get this sort of wide-eyed, and one of the reasons I love that is because it passes by a lot of people. A lot of people don't know that it's not real, right? But you can be trained to spot it. And when you look at how the brain is reacting during that, we have done our own EEG study of different kinds of smiles, and Richie Davidson did one with Paul Ekman. you get this pattern of prefrontal activity that looks a lot like fear and avoidance when people are doing that unfelt smile. So I think that makes it sort of fascinating. And there's one last one. You'll have to bear with me.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, everybody knows with the felt smile, not everybody, but a lot of psychologists now know, with the felt smile, you get this activation of the orbicularis muscle under the eyes. So you get this sort of like, smile. It's the real smile. But one of the things that we don't talk about enough is that movement turns out also to be really critical for sadness. So sadness, people know about, the corners of the mouth going down and the brow, in the middle portion of the brow going up. But then you add the eyes, and it really you have this visceral feeling response. So I think that little orbicularis movement, there's a lot to be done to understand what that's really involved with in our emotional lives.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Jim. I want to ask you now, after doing some of the best expressions I've ever seen someone do on call, what do you see in store for the future of emotion? Where do you think it's headed?
Let's see. I made a little note about that. The thing about the future is one of the things that's happened to me with I grew up in a very sort of basic emotions framework. That there's fear, sadness, disgust, joy, and then the other one, anger. I'm having a harder time with that right now because of my own data. So, for example, when we talked about the hand-holding effect, when you're holding hands with someone, a huge portion of what's supposed to be your stereotypic threat response just isn't happening. And we had to explain that. There's dozens of studies of this threat response. They call it a threat matrix or pain matrix or whatever it is. It's very stereotyped, but we sort of got rid of portions of it with hand-holding. Why? How could that happen if it's a single program that sort of rolls out? One of the things that we've been thinking a lot about in my lab is the idea of emergence and emergent properties in emotion. And this is not well researched at this point, but I want to put it this way. I think talking about emotional responses, there's no doubt the brain is kind of a collection of little specialized parts that do certain things very, very stereotypically, even though in combination they create all kinds of generalities and they're very, very flexible. The question is, why do they sometimes coordinate with each other and sometimes not? And I think the answer is going to be found a lot more in context and situation than people like I have been trained to think about emotions. Been really trained to think that emotions are these stereotype programs. If you hit the right button, it's just going to roll out, it's going to run, and then it's going to have a certain course. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. Even if there are certain universal facial expressions or something like that, I think we're going to need to disentangle that in the future with more complicated, sophisticated data analytic procedures and experimental paradigms. The other thing I would say for future researchers is to think carefully about what model they're going into when they're designing their research. What is their model of emotion? How do they think about emotions? It seems like a esoteric conversation, like one of those old "how many angels can dance on the head of a pin" arguments, right? But it has implications for how you design your studies, how you analyze your data, how you make inferences about what you find. And so I think a good grounding in emotion theory is really vital.
So then what advice would you have if we think about the future? I mean, it's such a big part of the future are students and other people interested in embarking in this mysterious and complicated field of emotion. What advice do you have for people like that, for future scholars of emotion?
I guess the first one would definitely be know the history of these. I mean, it's irritating, these debates that have been going on for 100 years about what emotions are, but it's also really useful and important to know those things so that you can frame the way you read empirical articles and the way you design your future research. The debates they seem to go on endlessly, but they really do matter. I think they're important. And then I think that what I've tried to argue in a recent paper is future researchers need to take really seriously the statistical and methodological implications of all those different models. We sort of design little pieces of the studies to address little pieces of the pie with emotion, and then theorize wantonly about from a set of assumptions that is the model that we hold. But all of these models, the basic emotion model, the sort of social constructivist models that Lisa Feldman Barrett talks about, all of these have statistical properties embedded in the models themselves. They're actually measurement models. And if they're actually measurement models, then we can treat them as such with real data if we design our studies the right way. It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to do. But you're among the people that are doing some really interesting work in this area. Iris Mouse and others. It's just hard. But the future is these things are complicated. And the good news is our measurement devices are getting so wonderfully sophisticated that everything from measuring psychophysiological responses to self-reports in sophisticated ways with iPhones. I mean, I think the future is really bright with regard to our ability to meet these challenges.
Oh, well, thanks so much for speaking with us today, Jim. This concludes our Expert in Emotion interview with Dr. Jim Coan from the University of Virginia.